My name is Dorothy Miller. I'm 67 years old, and if you'd told me that the day after I buried my husband, I'd be forced out of my own home by the two people I once loved most in this world, I would have smiled politely and said, "That's not something my son would ever do." But I would have been wrong. Very, very wrong, because what happened at that dinner table shattered something in me so deeply that even grief had to step aside and make room for something colder, sharper, and far more powerful. They thought they could bury me with my husband, turn the page on me like I was just a footnote in their story. But they forgot one small detail. I was the one who wrote every chapter of their lives until now, and I wasn't done yet. It was only 3 days after the funeral. The house still smelled faintly of lilies and lemon polish, and my hands were still stiff from writing thank you notes to neighbors who dropped off casseroles we never ate. I had barely slept, barely eaten, barely had time to sit still and realize that the man I spent 42 years beside was never coming back. But that night, I forced myself to come down for dinner with my son and daughter-in-law. I thought maybe we'd share a quiet meal, remember my husband, maybe even find some kind of comfort in each other's company. Instead, I found something else entirely. We were halfway through the roast chicken when Hannah looked up at me with that carefully rehearsed expression of sympathy, the one she probably practiced in the mirror, and she said words so sharp they might as well have been knives. "Now that your husband's gone, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back." And what broke me wasn't just her coldness. It was the way my son, my Michael, the boy I raised with scraped knees and bedtime stories, just nodded along like it was nothing. "The house was never really yours anyway," he said. No emotion, no guilt, just agreement. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even blink. I set my fork down, folded my napkin slowly, and stood up with all the dignity I had left. Though inside, something cracked wide open and began to burn. And through that quiet fire, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. They thought they had ended me, but all they really did was set me free. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. Just the essentials, the few things they hadn't already boxed up or claimed as their own. And I walked out of the house without a single backward glance. But instead of crumbling, instead of falling apart like they probably expected, I walked straight into the bank, not to beg, not to plead, but to remember who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's afterthought. I sat down across from a banker named Denise, a kind-faced woman with silver strands in her bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen a lot of women like me walk in after life had kicked them down. I gave her my name. She typed, paused, then turned the screen toward me with a look that said, "You might want to sit up for this." And when I saw what my husband had left behind, what we had built together in silence and trust over 4 decades, I realized I wasn't just still standing. I was holding the matchbook to burn it all down if I wanted to. Our business, Miller Home Restoration, was still active. The account was flush. My name was still on everything, and tucked beneath it was an investment account I hadn't even known existed, sitting untouched with over $700,000, quietly growing all these years. It was as if my husband had left one last whisper in my ear. If they ever try to erase you, don't let them. I transferred the funds into a new account under only my name. I closed out the joint accounts, signed new authorizations, and for the first time in years, I felt something I didn't even recognize at first. Power. Not the loud, stomping kind. The quiet, absolute kind that settles in your bones and tells you no one gets to write your ending for you. Before I left, Denise asked me softly if there was anything else she could help with, and without missing a beat, I smiled and said, "Yes. I'd like to look at real estate, because if the house was never really mine, then maybe I'd buy one that was, or maybe 2, maybe a street, maybe a legacy." I didn't know the details yet, but I knew this much. Whatever came next, it would be on my terms. That night, I sat in a quiet motel room just a few miles from the house I used to call home. The bed was hard, the air smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and I ate a turkey sandwich from a plastic tray, but I felt more alive than I had in years. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I took out a notebook and wrote down 5 words that would shape everything that followed. They think it's over. Good. Because what they didn't know was that I wasn't gone. I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke up early, though I hadn't really slept. The motel mattress was lumpy, the sheets too stiff, the hum of the air conditioner too loud and constant to offer peace. And yet none of that mattered because something inside me had shifted. Not like a breaking, no, more like the slow, quiet unlocking of a door that had been stuck for decades. I sat up slowly in that scratchy bed, my old joints groaning, my feet brushing the cold linoleum floor. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't reach instinctively for the other side of the bed. I didn't pause to listen for footsteps, or his voice, or the smell of his coffee drifting in from the kitchen. Instead, I wrapped myself in the cardigan I'd taken from the hallway closet before they could touch it, and I stood by the window with my hands around a paper cup of motel coffee, watching the early sunlight crawl up the sides of parked cars like it had somewhere to be. And I thought, if he left me all this, why didn't he tell me? We'd built that business together from nothing, back when Michael was still in elementary school, when we couldn't afford a babysitter, and I'd bring him to job sites with graham crackers and coloring books, while Frank tore down drywall and I kept track of every invoice in a spiral notebook with coffee stains and dreams scrawled in the margins. I wasn't just his wife, I was his partner, even if nobody ever said it out loud. And Frank was a quiet man. He never needed to announce things. He just did them. I guess leaving me those accounts, putting my name on every asset, hiding away that investment fund without ever telling our son. It was his way of keeping a part of me protected, even after he was gone. Maybe he sensed something I didn't. Or maybe he just knew that when the time came, I'd need something of my own to hold on to. After brushing my hair and pinning it back the way I always had, simple, clean, nothing fancy, I took the folder Denise had given me from the bank and tucked it into my handbag, then drove to the one place I hadn't dared to visit since the funeral, the old warehouse on Maple Street. It used to be Frank's dream, a space we could turn into a real office, maybe even expand into furniture restoration or a small design showroom. But things happened. Time passed. Michael grew up and got busy with his own life. The business kept going, but the building sat empty, gathering dust and cobwebs, just like the parts of me I thought I'd lost along the way. And now, standing in front of that cracked glass door with my name still faintly visible in the peeling gold letters, I realized this might be the first piece of ground I could reclaim, not just in a legal sense, but in my spirit. I stepped inside slowly, the door creaking like it recognized me. Dust rose in swirls, catching sunlight through broken blinds, and the air smelled like sawdust and forgotten stories. The old workbench Frank had once used still stood against the back wall, its surface scarred with decades of labor, love, and plans that never made it past the dreaming phase. I walked around the room in silence, trailing my fingers across the cold metal edge of a filing cabinet, the brittle spine of a sample catalog from 1994, the cracked leather of a rolling chair that had once been his favorite, and I stood in the center of the space, surrounded by decay and possibility, and I whispered to the emptiness, "We're not done yet." Back in the motel that evening, I made some calls. First to a realtor named Marcia, who owed me a favor from way back. Her mother and I used to make quilts together for the church auction. And then to a woman named Carla, who ran a small construction crew and used to help Frank with minor repairs. I didn't explain everything, not yet. Just told them I might be interested in buying. Quietly. Cash. They didn't ask many questions. I think they could hear in my voice that this wasn't about property. It was about history and something deeper than that. Within a few days, Marcia called back with a list of homes for sale in my old neighborhood. "Funny thing," she said. "The one right across the street from your old place just went up. Estate sale, needs work, but it's cheap." I didn't even blink. "I'll take it," I said. By the end of that week, I was standing in the doorway of a dusty little house with peeling blue paint and a rusted mailbox, looking straight across the street at my old porch, where I could just make out Hannah watering the flowers I had planted 2 summers ago, like they were hers now. But she didn't know that the new owner moving in was the same woman she told to leave and never come back. And I didn't intend to tell her. Not yet. The house wasn't much to look at. The kitchen smelled like mildew, the carpets were matted and stained, and the bathroom had tiles older than Michael. But it had strong bones, a solid foundation, and most importantly, it had a view. A perfect view of everything they'd stolen from me, and that alone made it worth every cent. I set to work right away, hired Carla's crew, brought in a dumpster, tore out cabinets, pulled up floors. I wore gloves and boots and tied my hair back tight and worked alongside them, because I wasn't just renovating a house, I was rebuilding myself. Every night after the crew left, I sat alone on the porch with a notebook in my lap, scribbling ideas for the warehouse, sketches of furniture layouts, lists of suppliers and materials. I wasn't just fixing drywall, I was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something real. The plan was simple. Reclaim what they threw away, build something they couldn't ignore, and make sure that every time they looked out their window, they saw proof that I was still standing. They said the house was never really mine. Well then, maybe it was time I owned the whole street. There's a strange kind of power that comes from being overlooked, a quiet kind of freedom that most people don't recognize until they've been pushed to the sidelines and forced to watch life go on without them. And that's exactly what they did to me. Cut me out, erased me, dismissed me with a few smug words and a shrug at the dinner table, as if I were nothing more than an afterthought in a story they had already finished reading. But what they didn't know was that, in the silence they left behind, I'd started writing a new chapter, not with rage or desperation, but with a steady, careful hand and a mind sharper than ever. They gave me the gift of invisibility, and while they sat comfortably in the house they thought they had taken from me, I began rebuilding something far more valuable than a roof and 4 walls. I began rebuilding myself. The house across the street came to life under my direction, not with flash or fanfare, but with purpose and momentum, and I oversaw every detail as if I were restoring more than just chipped paint and rotten wood. I was restoring the woman they thought they had left behind. Carla and her crew came early each morning, bringing in tools and lumber and tearing away the decay piece by piece, while I stood beside them in my work jacket and gloves, not just supervising, but sweating, lifting, choosing fixtures, matching tones, walking through each room like I already saw what it would become, because I did. Every decision I made was intentional, not just about aesthetics, but about control. Because for the first time in a long while, every inch of space was mine to shape exactly as I pleased. And no one could stop me or speak over me or ask me to step aside. Each morning before the crew arrived, I would sit on the small front porch of that old fixer-upper, sipping hot coffee from a plain travel mug, watching the sunrise stretch over the street while the shadows of my old house, the one they threw me out of, lingered long and low across the lawn like they were still trying to reach me. Sometimes I would see her standing in the window, that woman who married my son and took over my kitchen as if it were her birthright, glancing toward my side of the street with a flicker of something in her eyes that wasn't quite recognition but wasn't comfort either. And I never waved, never smiled, never gave her a reason to think she mattered anymore. I simply stood there quiet and calm, because when someone tells you to disappear and you return stronger, you don't owe them a single word. You just let them feel your presence in every breath they take. While the house took shape, I turned my attention to the old warehouse, the one Frank and I had always meant to renovate into a real office, a place that would carry our name and legacy into something lasting. And though it had sat empty and forgotten for years, walking into that space again made something deep inside me light up in a way I hadn't felt since before my hair turned gray. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet like they remembered me. the smell of dust and wood still thick in the air, and I ran my fingers across the old workbench, the same one Frank used to tinker at for hours, and I knew I had to bring it back to life, not just for me, but for everything we had dreamed of and never finished. I made calls, pulled permits, hired quiet hands, avoided attention, and slowly, methodically, I began transforming that forgotten space into something meaningful, something mine. Word traveled, as it always does in towns like ours, and before long I started seeing familiar faces around again, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered help, some just wanted to talk, to tell stories about the old days, about how Frank had helped them fix a broken door frame or how I had once made them soup after surgery. And I listened, nodding gently, absorbing every word as if they were pieces of the puzzle I was quietly putting back together. I never told them where I was living, never explained why I was back because I didn't need to. My work spoke louder than any explanation ever could, and in their eyes, I could see that they remembered who I was before they all forgot. Then one day, near dusk, when the sky was still pink and the air smelled like sawdust and paint, I heard the door creak open at the warehouse, and I turned around slowly, rag in hand, and saw my son standing in the doorway, silhouetted by fading sunlight, his face drawn and uncertain. He looked around the space, taking in the old workbench, the updated floor plan pinned to the wall, the tools laid out with care and purpose, and I stood perfectly still, not saying a word, letting him feel the weight of the moment as he stepped farther inside and tried to understand what he was looking at. I could see the questions forming in his mind, the flicker of familiarity in his eyes, the uncomfortable shift in his posture as the truth started pressing against the edge of his awareness. He didn't stay long, just lingered for a minute, unsure of what to say, then walked out the way he came. That night, as the lights flickered off one by one across the street, I sat on my porch with a blanket over my knees and a notebook in my lap, watching the glow of their kitchen fade into dark and knowing that something had changed, not in me, but in them. They had felt me, not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a presence they couldn't quite name, a question they couldn't quite answer, and that was all I needed, for now, because I wasn't finished. I was only beginning to weave myself back into the fabric of this place, thread by thread, brick by brick, with a calm smile and a checkbook full of quiet power, and they would never know what hit them until they realized I was no longer across the street. I was everywhere. It didn't take long for my presence to spread quietly through the neighborhood like the scent of bread baking in the background, warm, persistent, hard to ignore yet impossible to trace. I made sure everything I did looked ordinary, harmless even, but every decision I made had a deeper purpose, because I wasn't just buying property or fixing drywall, I was reclaiming space, slowly, strategically, and without ever raising my voice. One by one, small things began to change. A vacant lot 2 houses down went on the market, and within a week it belonged to a shell company I controlled through Marcia. The tired little duplex on the corner, the one with the crooked shutters and sagging porch, was sold at auction, and I bought it without ever stepping inside. The old florist shop, long since closed and forgotten, became mine after one phone call and a wire transfer. And still, no one knew. No one saw the web forming. No one realized that the woman they thought had been pushed aside was now the quiet owner of 4 properties within walking distance of the house they stole from her. I kept the work steady but humble. No flashy signs, no big trucks, just local contractors, small teams, and soft voices. Even Carla didn't know the full picture. She handled what I gave her and never asked why I kept buying, why I had plans sketched out for buildings I hadn't even touched yet, or why I smiled to myself when I stood on the porch each evening watching Hannah pull into the driveway like nothing had ever changed. I knew they were starting to sense something, that the unease had begun to settle into their routines, like dust they couldn't quite wipe away. I could see it in Michael's posture when he walked out to check the mailbox, in Hannah's habit of peeking through the blinds just a little too long, and though neither of them said a word, I knew they were starting to feel it. The shift, the imbalance, the growing presence of something they couldn't name but could no longer ignore. And then came the moment that nearly broke everything. It was a Thursday late afternoon, the sky thick with summer heat and clouds that never opened into rain, and I had just returned from meeting with a lawyer downtown who was helping me finalize the paperwork on yet another quiet acquisition when I pulled into the driveway and saw Hannah standing at the edge of my porch with a box in her arms. She looked startled, frozen even, like she hadn't expected me to come home so soon, and for a second we both stood there, just looking at each other across the short stretch of driveway, her face pale and tight, mine unreadable. My heart began to pound in a way it hadn't in years, slow and heavy and so loud in my ears that I could barely think, because that box she held was one I recognized. It had belonged to Frank, and I knew exactly what was inside. She said she had found it in the attic and thought it might belong to someone on our side of the street. She didn't say my name. She didn't acknowledge who I was, but her voice trembled ever so slightly when she spoke. And for a terrifying second, I thought she had figured it all out, that she had recognized me, that she had looked too closely and seen beyond the new clothes and the silver-streaked hair pulled back in a different way, and that the facade I had worked so carefully to construct was about to crack. I could feel the sweat on my palms, the stiffness in my back, the overwhelming need to stay perfectly calm as I walked slowly toward her, each step deliberate and quiet, as if the ground beneath us might give way with one wrong move. She held the box out to me, her fingers shaking just a little, and I took it with a soft nod, careful not to meet her eyes for too long, careful not to let anything in my face betray the storm that had begun to churn beneath the surface. I thanked her in the plainest voice I could manage and turned away quickly, stepping into the house and closing the door behind me with hands that trembled harder than I wanted to admit. For several minutes, I just stood there in the hallway, holding that box like it contained something radioactive, my breath shallow and unsteady because I had come so close, so painfully close, to being unmasked, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But as I sat down on the living room floor and opened the box, slowly, carefully, like it might explode, I found only blueprints, handwritten notes, and a few old invoices from the early years of our business. Nothing revealing, nothing dangerous, nothing that could connect the new version of me to the woman they had discarded, like a winter coat in spring. And in that moment, as my pulse began to slow and my breath returned to something closer to normal, I let myself smile. Not out of relief exactly, but out of something deeper, something stronger, something like victory held just out of sight. Because even if they didn't recognize me yet, they were starting to feel me again. In the corners of their routines, in the quiet shift of the street around them, in the subtle way the world was beginning to bend away from them and towards something else, something older, wiser, and far more prepared. That evening, I sat on the porch once more, this time with the box beside me and a new set of sketches resting on my lap. I watched the lights come on in their living room, watched Michael walk through the kitchen like a ghost of his former self, watched Hannah stare through the curtains as if searching for something just beyond her reach. And I knew they were close to seeing it. That moment where the shape in the shadows finally becomes clear, where the echo of the past grows too loud to ignore, and I didn't feel anger or spite or fear. I felt calm, because I still had more pieces to move, more ground to claim, and more silence to fill with meaning. And when the time came, they would realize that the woman they tried to erase had never really left. She had just stepped into the quiet where she could see everything. And now, with a pen in her hand and the city at her feet, she was writing herself back into the story, line by line, deal by deal, and house by house. By the time summer had started to settle into its softer edges, with the thick heat giving way to golden evenings and the first whisper of autumn clinging to the breeze, I had already secured ownership of 6 properties within a 2-block radius, finalized the lease on a small commercial storefront 2 streets over, and signed a contractor agreement to restore the old Miller and Sons building into a custom furniture studio and community workshop, all without a single public announcement or headline, because the kind of satisfaction I was after didn't come from applause or credit. It came from watching the people who once dismissed me slowly realize that the ground was shifting beneath them, and they had no idea who was holding the shovel. From my perch on the porch each night, I watched as their lives started to fray around the edges. Nothing dramatic, not yet, but enough to sense it. Michael's business calls were shorter now, more tense, his voice rising just slightly when he thought no one could hear. Hannah began parking on the street instead of the driveway, coming and going in a rush as if the house no longer held the comfort it once promised. I'd overheard from Sheila at the bakery that vendors had stopped answering Michael's calls, that old clients were turning elsewhere, and though no one could quite say why, I knew it was because I'd quietly begun working with the very people he used to depend on, reminding them of the years when integrity meant something, and when our name, my name, stood for quality. Then one late afternoon, just as the light began to slide across the rooftops in that soft, cinematic way that makes everything feel more exposed, I saw Michael step off his porch and start walking directly toward mine. I'd been sitting quietly with a notepad, going over layout sketches for the storefront, and for a brief second my hand froze over the page, because something about his face, tight, uncertain, tired, told me he wasn't just out for a neighborly visit. He was carrying a folder, probably contracts or estimates, and as he approached, I could feel my heartbeat shift, not in fear, but in anticipation, like the slow turning of a final key in a lock you've been building around someone for months. He stepped onto the porch and greeted me in that professional tone people use when they don't remember where they know you from, but they know they've seen your face before. He introduced himself as the owner of Miller Home Restoration, said he was trying to reconnect with some of the new buyers in the area, and asked if I might be in need of remodeling services. I looked at him carefully. The man who once called me a burden over dinner, the boy I held against my chest after every bad dream, now standing there in khakis and a wrinkled polo shirt, sweat along his hairline and pride clinging to him like armor that no longer fit. I told him I was already working with someone, that I had a team I trusted, and I watched his mouth tighten slightly. The corners of his eyes twitched just enough to register the sting of rejection. He asked who I was working with, and when I gave him Carla's name, I saw the light in his eyes dim, just for a moment, like a door closing a little too hard. He said something about Carla being a good choice, that they used to work together, and then fell into a brief silence, looking around the porch like he was searching for something familiar, something solid to cling to. And I swear, just for a second, he looked at me not as a stranger, but as someone he almost recognized, like the shadow of a memory he didn't want to admit. He asked if I'd lived here long, and I told him I'd only recently returned to the neighborhood, said I liked how it felt, familiar, but ready for change. He nodded, awkwardly, thanked me for my time, and turned to leave, but he paused at the bottom of the steps, folder in hand, and looked back at me one more time, with a look I couldn't quite read. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but it wasn't comfort either. It was confusion, unsettled, quiet confusion. And then he walked away. I sat there for a long time after he left, the sun dipping behind the house that used to be mine, casting shadows across my porch and his, and I thought about how strange it is that people never see the truth until it's standing right in front of them, wearing a different face and carrying the weight of every choice they tried to bury. He hadn't recognized me. Not really. Not fully. And even if part of him had begun to sense something, he didn't have the courage to follow it. Because if he had looked just a little closer, he might have seen that the woman rebuilding the neighborhood one lot at a time was the same woman he once told to pack her bags and disappear. They called it not mine. But now, every brick, every nail, every deed said otherwise, and I wasn't finished. Not yet, because the final move was still coming. The one that would make sure they never forgot what happens when you try to erase a woman who helped build everything you're standing on. By the time the leaves began to shift into their rust-colored jackets and the evenings cooled just enough to carry the smell of distant fireplaces, the neighborhood had changed in ways that most people couldn't quite name, but everyone could feel. The corner lot that had sat empty for years was now being turned into a community garden, funded by a local donor. The florist shop reopened under a new name with the same gentle tilting sign, and the duplex had been transformed into a craftsman-style rental with soft blue shutters and a stone path Dorothy Miller herself had sketched on a napkin in the quiet hours before dawn. My name, of course, was never mentioned, not on paper, not in casual conversations, but I was everywhere, in the air, in the sidewalks, in the decisions, quietly shaping the future of the street they once thought they owned. Michael's business had grown fragile by then, paper-thin and hollow, held up only by the memory of his father's reputation and the last few clients who hadn't heard what others now whispered in hardware stores and lumber yards. Hannah's smile had grown sharp and tight, her posture stiff whenever I passed, and their house, my house, began to lose its shine. The shutters needed painting, the gutters sagged, the lawn grew patchy and tired. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make them feel the slow unraveling, enough to make them wonder when things had started slipping through their fingers. Then, one warm October afternoon, a letter arrived at their door. Not loud, not legal, not threatening, just a simple cream-colored envelope with my initials pressed into the wax on the back. Inside was a formal notice of purchase. The mortgage, it said, had been bought out. The lien had changed hands. Effective immediately, ownership of the house they called theirs now belonged to a private trust. They came to the porch that evening, both of them, tense and uncertain, holding the letter like it might burn them. I stayed seated, legs crossed, a cup of tea warm in my hands, the autumn wind gentle against my cheek. They asked what it meant. I told them what they already knew. The house was never mine, they once said. And now they were right, because now it belonged to me in full, on paper, in title, in every way that mattered. I gave them 30 days to vacate, but not because I wanted to humiliate them. I wanted them to feel what it meant to be powerless, to watch everything slip away slowly like I had, to know that the place they used as a weapon had been reclaimed, not in anger, but in quiet, calculated purpose. For a moment, I almost softened. I almost believed that was enough, that taking back the house, the business, the name, and the respect was sufficient, that I could move forward and let it end there. I even thought about giving them one last chance to apologize, not for forgiveness, not for repair, but just to see if they could find a sliver of decency still hiding in them after everything. And when they stood on my porch again a few days later, eyes heavy, hands empty, I thought perhaps that moment had come. But instead of humility, I saw entitlement. Instead of remorse, I saw expectation. They wanted me to fix it for them, to undo what they had done, to rescue them from the storm they had summoned. And in that moment, something inside me finally settled. I didn't owe them kindness. I didn't owe them comfort. I owed them clarity. A week later, the house was empty. I stood alone in the living room where I had once decorated Christmas trees and iced birthday cakes, where I had whispered prayers beside Frank's hospital bed, where I had packed my bag in silence after being told to leave. I walked through the rooms, slowly, one by one, running my fingers along the walls, remembering how I once thought this house was everything. But now I understood it was never about the walls or the furniture or the memories trapped in the floorboards. It was about the woman who had carried all of that inside her and refused to be erased. Just as I was about to lock the door behind me, a young couple walked up the front path. Newlyweds, they said, expecting their first child, full of plans and hope and laughter. I handed them the keys without a second thought. Let the house begin again. Let it serve a new story, one not built on betrayal, but on beginnings. I didn't need it anymore. I had built something far greater. That evening, I returned to the small cottage I now called home, the one with the climbing ivy, the warm kitchen light, the porch swing that creaked just slightly in the wind. And as I sat there, tea in hand, watching the golden sky melt into night, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt at peace. Not because I had taken revenge, but because I had taken back my name, my dignity, my place in the world. I didn't destroy them. I simply refused to disappear. And in that quiet refusal, I had become something unshakable. I don't know what became of them after that. I heard whispers, something about a small rental in the next county, job applications gone unanswered, a marriage stretched too thin to hold, but I didn't need the details. I had everything I needed. And now, if you're still listening, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you didn't belong somewhere? Like your presence was an inconvenience? Like you were just a temporary guest in a life you helped build? What did you do? Did you walk away quietly? Or did you, like me, come back stronger, quieter, and more powerful than they ever imagined? Tell me your story, because I know I'm not the only one.